Well, good morning, all. Welcome. Oh, we have Steve Howe here, who's a reporter for the Democrat and Chronicle. And you've probably, if you read the paper at all, you've undoubtedly read some of his articles. And in this morning's paper, he has articles on the mayor race and the city council race. So you dabble in politics as well.
All right. I do.
Too strong.
Yeah,
Thank you. We'll try this.
that's better.
Okay. Steve's from Bainbridge, New York, near Binghamton, which is the carousel capital of the world, for those of you who are not aware of that. And he's a graduate of RIT, and he specializes in environmental issues, nature issues, but also dabbles in politics, apparently.
Well, with the staffing of the paper, we all have to wear a lot of hats, so.
Okay. And Steve will be filling us in on an overview of environmental issues in our region. Thank you.
No problem. Well, morning, everybody. This isn't usually the type of thing that I do, as a print journalist. One of the fun things is being able to hide behind your computer and your recorder, but it's always fun to be out and talking to you. And I'm going to try to treat this as some sort of reverse interview, so I can feel a little more comfortable with it. But I'm at least comfortable with the space. As I was telling Bob earlier, this the Shaw Room doubles as the green room for the stage out there, and I've done a few shows with the Off Monroe Players. If anyone's not doing anything, November 14th, 15th, 16th, and 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, there's going to be a double feature of Trial by Jury. It's all Gilbert and Sullivan stuff, Trial by Jury, and then Less Miserable, which is a farce of Les Mis, using the music and a bunch of Easter eggs from Gilbert and Sullivan. So if you like Pinafore or, Pirates of Penzance, there's some songs from that scattered throughout. And the performances are free. And I'm not here to shill that, but since we're in the Shaw Room, I couldn't help but mention that. So quick who I am. Bob did a good job of introducing me. But I'm a reporter at the Democrat and Chronicle, and my technical title is I'm the weather, climate, and Great Lakes reporter. But as was pointed out, I wear a lot of different hats depending on what the paper needs. I've worked all throughout New York State. Like I said, I was born in upstate New York. I've worked in Cortland, I worked in Binghamton, I worked in Utica, and I spent 5 years in Tooele County, Utah as well. Lived in Salt Lake City at the time, so kind of was able to see a bit of a different perspective on some of these climate and environmental issues. And part of the reason we're talking a little bit about environmental issues and zoning specifically today, which I apologize for bringing you guys in to talk a little bit about zoning. But I was a city government reporter for a long time before taking on this role. And there is definitely some overlap between what's happening on the local level and what's happening in the environment and with climate change. And I just thought it was a good time to talk about that, because I think people often underestimate how much impact on the local level people can have on the climate.
I'm gonna try again with the mic.
Okay.
Just bring it down, but like that, maybe that'll help.
Okay. Is that better?
Is that better?
Okay. And if anyone has any questions throughout, you can feel free to chime in. And there'll be time for questions at the end, I'm sure. I haven't timed out this presentation. Again, I'm not a public speaker generally, so we're doing what we can. So, just real quick, talking a little bit about what is zoning. And, zoning determines how land is used by and large, residential, commercial, industrial. And in a lot of ways, it dictates, the nature of communities. It determines what can be built where. It determines what a private property owner can do with their private property. And, obviously, because of that, it has sort of an outsized influence on development and, as a result, climate. And I'll be making those connections a little bit later. And there's different types of zoning. Obviously, like I said, residential, but that's broken down into subcategories. So there's single family, multifamily, all of that. And the connection with climate change kind of comes in a couple different ways, and that's determining how a community continues to grow, especially a community like Rochester, where we're looking at, infill, we're looking at redevelopment, we're looking at projects like, the inner loop. And when you're taking out a highway and replacing it with different uses, what does that look like? And how can you achieve some of those goals that are climate related? One thing I wanted to run through really quick here are the smart growth principles for sustainable development. This is actually something that the EPA developed in the past that talks about, what are some good principles and that connect to sustainability, and as a result, climate change as well. So it looks for a mixture of land uses. It looks for compact building design, a range of housing choices. So that includes single family detached homes all the way up through, larger apartment buildings. It tries to promote walkable neighborhoods, create distinctive communities so that there's like a feel and a flavor, to each place. This isn't about homogenizing things. In a lot of ways, it's about creating greater diversity of housing options and, affordable housing up to obviously more expensive housing for people that are looking for that. And that density is a good tool for preserving open space and, offering up varieties of transportation choices and creating predictable development decisions. Because obviously the important thing about zoning is it's telling the people that are coming into our communities and building these apartment buildings and these homes, this is what you're able to build where. And these zoning codes are not updated very often. So these are obviously major decisions. And, the city of Rochester itself right now is looking at updating its zoning for the first time in more than 20 years. So there's some relevance to that part of it as well. So I just wanted to talk quickly about residential density and greenhouse gas emissions, because in Rochester, housing is actually the #1 driver of greenhouse gas emissions, more than transportation and other uses like that. So, one thing that having higher density can do is it can decrease vehicle miles traveled on average by 20 to 40%, which lowers transportation emissions. It reuses existing infrastructure. So if you're taking, let's say, a former parking lot and you're building an apartment building in there, you're not creating miles of new road, you're not creating new sewer water lines, which saves money, and it also reduces the impact of creating all of that new development. It puts homes and schools and workplaces closer together, which makes it, better for walking, for biking, for public transit, which obviously has benefits for people that are looking for those amenities. And it works to, preserve green space as well. When I was out in Utah, it was growing rapidly in Tooele County, a very sort of different situation, not a lot of redevelopment. I was working in a rural county that was primarily farmland, sheep farms, horse farms, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden you had thousands of people moving into this neighborhood, moving into these planned developments, these villages, doubling their population or more. And, there's obviously concerns about how do you have a cost-effective development, but how do you also preserve green space? And for a building developer, density is good because of all those things. You're not building as much sewer and water lines. You're not building as much roads if you're able to kind of push everything together. But then you're working against a community that was saying, hey, we have 5-acre lots traditionally. We have room for people to have a horse paddock on their property. What's the trade-off here where you're going to try to build 1/2-acre lots? And often what the deal that would be worked out through the zoning and through the planning boards in these communities is if you're going to build 1/2-acre lots, then you have to build to the scale essentially of each of these being 5-acre lots. And then all of that extra land that isn't being put into those tighter housing units becomes open space. It becomes park space. It becomes natural space. There's walking trails, there's hiking trails, that sort of thing. So, you can still preserve green space, you can still preserve, sort of the nature of, in this case, the sort of like desert scrubland that was pretty common out there, while also still building housing at density that's better for developers, gets people to move in, reduces some of those barriers. So, there's trade-offs in zoning, and, Tulare County, Utah, still growing rapidly. And that was a trade-off because it was rapidly becoming a bedroom community to Salt Lake City. And another aspect of density is that it generally is more adaptable to climate impacts because of, again, things like preservation of green space. One of the big potential impacts of climate change here is going to be flooding because of increased heavy precipitation events. So we might get the same average amount of rainfall, but it's falling in less storms and it's falling at a greater intensity, which obviously leads to flash flooding and issues like that. Being able to preserve green space, alongside rivers and creeks, and having somewhere for all of that water to go is important. And by increasing density for housing, that's one of the ways that you can potentially offset that, because you're going to capture more water in a field or a stormwater basin that's designed for that than you are even on like single family lots spread out with fences and, different water spouts and all kinds of different issues that you're going to have when you're doing it home by home by home. And I wanted to bring up Fairport here because Fairport's also overhauling their zone. It's a little more manageable to talk about than Rochester, which has a lot of different zoning types, a lot of different uses. Fairport, it's just a little easier to get your arms around. So that's the example that I decided to pull for this. And, it was an interesting entry point for me, because the first time that I looked at the Fairport zoning situation was at a meeting for Color Fairport Green, which is one of the Color Your Community Green through the Climate Solutions Accelerator. And a lot of the discussion that they had was, how do we get those smart growth principles that I was talking about enacted in Fairport? And obviously Fairport is a community with a really distinctive look and feel. And it is overwhelmingly single family homes, and it has the quaint Main Street. And you end up with this push and pull pretty much out of the gate of, if you're going to permit growth, where do you permit the growth where you can protect the character of those neighborhoods while also achieving those goals of more walkability, more sustainability? And, this is the first time that they've tackled their zoning in 30 years. In 1992 was the last time there was a comprehensive zoning update in Fairport. So a lot has changed in that amount of time. I mean, I was born in 1991, so you can live a whole lot. You can live a whole life in that amount of time, I guess is my point. But the zoning districts that were streamlined, that was one of the benefits of the draft zoning plan that came out. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, these really quick. So they were residential low density, residential neighborhood, residential transitional neighborhood, general neighborhood, downtown, industrial, and canal district. And when you have a place like Fairport that is, overwhelmingly residential, overwhelmingly single family, when you're looking at, if is there a way to increase density, you want to do it sort of in a tiered approach. So the downtown area has, permission to build, mixed use development. So we're talking ground floor residential, we're talking apartment or commercial, and then apartments above, which, I mean, I think we've all seen all over the place. It's always funny when developers talk about like, oh, we're going to do mixed use developments. Like it's this, brand new idea. When I know in the little town that I grew up in of 1,600 people, all of the shops along Main Street are on the ground floor and everything above it is apartments. It's sort of, time is cyclical. We're back around to the innovative idea from 130 years ago. But there's as it tiers down. So you go from downtown general neighborhood. You can have apartment buildings or multi-family dwellings of 5+ units, and then it keeps kind of scaling down and down into the low density. And there was a few things that the draft code is doing that, sort of A, codify some things that are already happening, and B, sort of make sure that you're controlling how that growth filters out. So you can have duplexes, essentially 2 families in a single home throughout the area that's permitted now, but they've added restrictions to it. So to create a new one, all the old ones have been grandfathered in, all of those are conforming now. They were non-conforming for years. Everyone knew they were there. There's dozens of them in the town. But now those have been codified, those are permitted uses. And now if you want to make a new one, your house has to have 3,000 square feet, which is pretty big. And somebody actually, from Fairport Green went through and found there was about 36 properties in the entire village that had homes big enough that you could actually subdivide them into that 2-family home. The new zone update would also allow accessory dwelling units, or like in-law suites, they're also called, but those also came with a host of restrictions. So if they're detached, they can't have a kitchen, they can't have second floor plumbing, there's all these restrictions. So, you couldn't take a detached garage and turn it into a housing unit. It would need to be connected to the main building, or you would have to take away, again, all the parts that would make it viable as an independent apartment. But accessory dwelling units have become like a popular solution, at least, in development circles, as a way to keep the character of a neighborhood, but also add more housing units. I know when I was out in Utah, 5-6 years ago, that was a big discussion there as well. Is they're like, well, hey, instead of building, all of these apartment buildings, what if we just, what if I extend my driveway to an ADU in the back, accessory dwelling unit in the back, and now we're adding, a young professional who wants to live in the community and have a house, but isn't ready maybe to buy their own place, And the Fairport Code, does allow this to their benefit, but because of the restrictions, there is a little bit of you can do it, but it's tough to thread the needle. And a lot of that is by design, because like one of the ways, the zoning works is it's restrictive. It's intentionally restrictive in a lot of cases. You're not only just telling people what you can build where, you're telling people what you can't build where. And a lot of communities use it defensively because they want to preserve the character of their neighborhoods, and they want to protect their property value, and they want to make sure that you're not, blocking their view of something downtown or what the case may be. So it's a difficult balancing act. Obviously, it's tough for municipal governments to kind of make it through, where you have people that are talking about what can we do, from a climate standpoint, how can we build housing that uses less energy? Because if you're in an apartment building with 5+ units, you use on average half the energy that a single family detached home does. Some of that square footage, but a lot of that is the fact that when you have a housing unit above you and a housing unit to the side of you, you don't have that exposed exterior wall, So there's a lot of push and pull, connected to this. And, talking a little bit about that, there's concerns about the aesthetic change. There was a lot of public comments that are all available to be read. People worried about what's Fairport going to look like if we allow this greater density. Are we not going to be able to see downtown? We're not going to be able to see the church steeple as we drive down into town. These are the things that people are talking about because, this is a place that they live and have a connection to and are concerned about changes to. There was concerns about traffic as well. And there's been parking studies done that indicate that there's enough parking in Fairport, but is it in the right places? And that's another discussion as well, because another part of smart growth is, a push away from parking minimums, which is another common part of zoning that dates back to the 1950s, where it's if you have a, restaurant, you have to have X number of parking spots, which a big part of the concern about parking minimums is it's always built out to the maximum expected usage. There's a reason, when you go to a mall around here, there's acres and acres of parking, and most of the year it sits completely empty. But then on Black Friday or, Christmas Eve or wherever it might be, they might use 80-90% of that parking, and then that sort of, justifies the use. But that's also why a lot of cities, Rochester included, have acres and acres and acres of parking downtown where there could be buildings or there were buildings. So obviously kind of trying to pull back some of those parking restrictions is part of that because you can put a better use to the land. It doesn't generate much tax revenue. You're running water and sewer lines through a parking lot that could be an apartment building, or it could be a commercial, building. So there's some push and pull, but again, you're pushing back always on the municipal level against people wanting to preserve where they live. The flip side of that too is when you have, jumping ahead, we'll get to stamp in a second, is, there's people that are also being not just priced out of these communities, but forced to move because of the circumstances of it, right? Let's say, you and your spouse have a single family standalone home, you raised your 3 kids there, they're off to college, they've grown up, they're adults now, they have their own kids. They're struggling to find a way to live in Fairport if they want to because of the price of housing, because there's a limited stock. It's a supply and demand situation. But then when you're ready to move out of that bigger house, because maybe you're hitting a point in your life where you're like, I don't want to do the yard work anymore. I don't want to, climb up on the roof and clear out the gutters, and you want to stay in your community, you want to stay next to the people that you've known your whole life. Where do you go? And a lot of times there isn't that missing middle they talk about, which is single family homes and then high density luxury, apartments and condos. Where's the in between those two extremes of density, and also those two kind of pricey options? Where do people kind of fit into the middle? And a lot of the talk about increasing density in a place, again, I keep picking on Fairport just because that's the example I'm using, not because Fairport is unique. I mean, this is happening everywhere around the country and around the state. But yeah, how do you kind of thread the needle on that in-between point? And that's part of the reason people are talking about increased density. And I feel like I've, harped on on residential housing for a while now, but obviously, like I said, it's a big driver of greenhouse gases. But I did want to talk as well a little bit about STAMP, which is the Western New York Science Technology Advanced Manufacturing Park in Genesee County. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it's a greenfield advanced manufacturing park that is about 1,250 acres of land and located adjacent to the Tonawanda Seneca Indian Nation and a federal wildlife preserve and some federal wildlife land as well. It's former agrarian land. It's flat. It's great for building, data centers, which is what they're trying to build out there because it's relatively stable. It's relatively flat. So the development potential there is high, but then you run into other issues. First of all, we'll talk about the benefits here real quick. According to obviously the developers, there's 500 buildable acres on that are available. No corporate income tax. There's a lot of state money. There's been tens of millions of state dollars poured into getting the site shovel ready, as they call it. So you can pretty much kick off construction right away. But the 2 tenants that are there right now, Plug Power and Edwards Vacuum, are still struggling to get a foothold, which is sort of where the data center recently comes in, and we'll talk about that. So, obviously the Tonawanda Seneca Nation is opposed to the facility. It's right next to their land. It's right next to, some important sacred and cultural sites for them as well. And then you have the National Wildlife Refuge. There's already been some issues when they tried to put in a wastewater line through the refuge where it spilled. Fracking liquid got into the refuge. They actually had a permit pulled because of that, so they couldn't use horizontal drilling, which is, digging a underground trench and running the pipe through because of the spill. Yeah.
No, we had fracking in New York State.
Well,
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, so she said we didn't have fracking, and it's not fracking in the sense of getting out, like extracting natural gas, but it's using the same technology to run pipes underground, where you're doing like horizontal drilling and breaking through the ground that way. So it's not about extraction, but it is obviously Yes, essentially. Yeah, it's the same technology. Drilling just for infrastructure as opposed to going down into, the pockets in the bedrock and breaking those up to get to natural gas. So you're not going to get, earthquakes from it, but obviously, it's sort of a repurpose of that. And with the spill that happened, obviously there's still concerns with how that technology is used when you're polluting a national wildlife refuge. And Fish and Wildlife is the one who pulled the permit because they were the ones who were allowing that line to come through. So Genesee County Economic Development is looking at alternatives to that. But there's a lot of concerns to that point of the infrastructure. This is going to be built, if this data center is built, this 900,000 square foot data center, might be bigger because they're going back to the drawing board to potentially make it larger. This is a town of 1,900 people. It doesn't have the water infrastructure. It doesn't have the sewer infrastructure. The electricity is going to be provided once a plant is built on site from hydroelectric energy from Niagara Falls. So that's the green part of the project, I suppose. But it kind of brings up issues about when we talk about zoning, what's being built where, and is it being built in the right place? Because you're talking about a server farm, essentially, lots of computers running around the clock, a lot of noise, consistent noise, a lot of disruption to not just nearby residents, but to wildlife that uses the refuge. So, I mean, there's a lot of concerns about, I don't know where my U went there on or K went on New York there. But also, it said New York when I wrote it last night, I'm sure of it. Where's your copy editor when you need it? But I know it's tough to read, but I wanted to talk about New York's smart growth criteria because this is sort of the state's guide to where they think it's good to build a project like STAMP. And, they want to put it somewhere that use, maintain, or improve existing infrastructure, to advance projects located in municipal centers, to advance projects in developed areas or areas designated for concentrated infill development, to protect, preserve, and enhance the state's resources, including agricultural land, forests, surface and groundwater, to foster mixed land uses and compact development, including brownfield redevelopment. And I can keep going. There's 10 criteria, but as you can see, this isn't really a project STAMP that follows many of those smart growth criteria, by the state itself. And this is from the same state that has been pumping, again, tens of millions of dollars into this site to try to attract. Originally, it wasn't data centers. Originally, it was advanced manufacturing. So think like semiconductors, microchips, that sort of a project, and not the data centers, which obviously consume incredible amounts of water, incredible amounts of energy, which obviously is not good for the environment, not good for climate. And there's been a lot of pushback on a bunch of different grounds, the environmental grounds, the cultural significance of the area, just the fact that does it really make sense to build something like this in what's essentially a field in Genesee County?
Why are they not carrying out the original?
Well, because it's a not uncommon practice, especially, in the past 20 years or so, for, the state to create these development areas essentially, and then go get the tenant. So the state pumps all the money for infrastructure, for getting it, shovel ready, running electricity, trying to get water and sewer, at least established on these sites. And then sort of reverse engineering, having a company come in and use their facility because it's ready to go. So they built it with the intention of attracting a semiconductor company, an Intel or something like that, to come in and build a facility, a Micron. But as time drags on and that money's been invested, oftentimes these developments will pivot because they've already sunk all this money into it to get it ready for something. And then all of a sudden, if you've got a data center that's willing to come in, use a bunch of the land, pay for it, you know what I mean, create a few jobs, that sort of thing, it becomes, well, do we, it's a sunk cost fallacy in a lot of ways, right? We've already spent the money, we spent a lot of taxpayer money to attract somebody in. That didn't really work out the way we thought. So do we just leave it, or do we get somebody else to come in? When I was in Utica, that was a situation up there where they had a very similar situation. It was agrarian land just north of the city in Marcy, New York. And they were eventually able to get a semiconductor fab put in there. But I mean, it was the same story. It was 20 plus years. It was millions and millions of dollars. And the parent company of that semiconductor fab is having financial troubles right now. So there's concerns that they'll never finish the build out of the plant, which was supposed to create 600 jobs. So, there's been a lot of, if you build it, they will come development practices. And that hasn't always been the case.
One of the obvious things that occurs to me is Kodak has gone through quite a transition with lots of land in their park. Now, I don't know what the timing was on the Genesee, but why wouldn't that have been looked into before they put in all the expensive infrastructure, which already was there at the Kodak Park?
Some of that, I mean, there's different reasons. A lot of developers, a lot of companies like the thought of greenfield development because then they get to build new. They don't have to deal with the past remediation. They don't have to deal with any of the hamstringing of what came before because it was just a field. They can come there and they can build whatever they want, and they don't have to there isn't going to be too much infrastructure and there isn't going to be, that sort of thing. So from a developer standpoint, greenfields are attractive because that kind of cleans their hands of like, why do I have to, come into this place? Like what's under the ground here, that sort of situation.
But this was the state that sponsored this, right?
Yeah. But the state
Not
also
the developer.
True. But and the other component to that too, when you're talking from the government standpoint, is that every county has a economic development corporation, and they're all sort of in competition with each other as well, right? So Genesee County wants to grab as much state money as they can to create this sort of a business environment, an industrial park, so that they can benefit their citizens, even though it's always been marketed as, being between Rochester and Buffalo so that they can attract workers from, both of those areas. It's still, this is a boon for us. So we want to do this. And then so does Monroe County, and so does Oneida County, and so does Onondaga County. So to a certain extent, it's a bit of that sort of inter-county competition creates this thing. So instead of a more comprehensive, like, hey, where in the state can we put this? It becomes, all right, this county has this opportunity. This county has this opportunity. They're all pitching these companies. The companies are coming, they're touring these sites, that have been prepared for them to determine where they want to put it. We're competing with other states. You know what I mean? There's a lot of, unfortunately, layers to this where, as opposed to maybe where is the best location, it comes to where is the most attractive location to this company that wants to open a data center or a chip fab or whatever the case may be.
The incentives are wrong.
It's not my job to say, but
where would the environmental concerns come in on the considerations from the state?
There's always environmental review. It's called seeker for every project, really regardless of scale. That's going to be new development like that. But it's not particularly difficult to get a negative declaration, I call it, where you can say, these are the steps we're going to take to mitigate our environmental impact. And then, as usually the local development corporation will work with the developer, you know what I mean, to say like, hey, what can you guys do about where your wastewater is going to go? What can you do about sound? What you can do? So there's a negotiation there essentially to where they feel like it meets those state criteria. and then I can pass through the process. So there is an environmental component to it, but unless it's particularly egregious, a lot of that manages to make its way through the development process. Yeah.
Here we are in our environmental situation, with our environmental situation being disastrous.
Mhm.
We've already gone over the edge. We have to come back up. Why isn't that number one for everyone? It's for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, again, probably not qualified to answer that question, but I think that, there's obviously some, motivations outside there besides what are we doing to protect the environment? What are we doing to preserve our climate? What are we doing to mitigate the impacts of climate change? When there's money to be made, that has an impact. And, I think even politically, people are incentivized because, if they had, let's say, landed that semiconductor fab like they wanted at the stamp site, then that's something that, the local politicians, the local development corporation gets to brag about because it went the way that they thought it was going to go. There's a political calculus, I think, and a, economic calculus that's baked into these decisions that sometimes supersedes, is this the best location? Is this going to, preserve the environment and protect it for generations to come? And I think that that's not just on projects the size of Stamp. I think that that's kind of throughout, even small decisions that people make. When it comes to where's housing located, I'm not picking on Fairport. I just done reporting on Fairport, but they talk about the high density concerns, what's going to do to the nature of even Main Street to have those taller buildings. But like there are condos and there's apartments and there's townhomes that are being built right around the edges of Fairport, right against the border. And those people are there because they want to take advantage of what Fairport has to offer, right? The downtown and the shops and the restaurants and the coffee shops and everything else. And then they have these concerns about parking, but how do those people get to there? They don't live upstairs of the coffee shop they want to go to, so they're driving in. You know what I mean? So it's not even major things like that. It's even zoning, like the whole discussion we've been having. There's a lot of different forces, at work behind development. And I think all too often climate and environment is not the top priority of local governments, state governments, and certainly in many cases, not developers either, because, they're chasing profit.
I guess I'm unclear. What is the status of the stamp project now with all these different, and maybe you said what it was, and can it be stopped or is it going forward? Or, there were those concerns that you showed and
Yeah,
all the problems, all the impacts, disastrous impacts in my mind. And yet, and who gets to decide? Genesee County, the developer, the state? Who could put a stop to it or could anybody?
yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, the development corporation, which owns the property, you know what I mean? It sort of has a bit of a say in where that ends up. And there's been pushback, there's been lawsuits actually. Part of the reason that they went back to the drawing board is that the Tonawanda Seneca Nation had put up a lawsuit about sort of some procedural issues with how they'd gone about it. And instead of addressing those, the developer just pulled their application and is going to reapply essentially. And that's why they've talked about potentially growing the scale of the project. Because they're like, well, if we're going to go back to the drawing board, why not make it bigger?
There's a problem. Why not make it bigger?
So, it's tricky because, and this goes back again to the broader discussion on zoning, people have property rights, you know what I mean? And they can build things as long as they are permitted. That's why I think, when communities like Rochester and Fairport go through the zoning process, it's really important to get it right, so to speak, because usually you're going to be stuck with these decisions for 20 or 30 years before there's going to be the political will to update your zoning or update your planning. And if you have a use that's permitted and you own the property, there's not as many avenues to prevent that. You know what I mean? Even on small scale, when I was in Utica, there was a former restaurant that had been closed for a year or so. They wanted to knock it down and build a convenience store. It was a very residential neighborhood. People were concerned about what that would do. And, I went to the public meeting and ran into some people that I knew afterwards, and they were like, well, what do you think's going to happen with it, Steve? Are they going to build the gas station there? And I was like, people are mad. And I was like, well, they're going to build it. And they're like, well, why are you so sure? I was like, well, they have the zoning. It's a permitted use in the zoning, and they own the property. There's not, you know what I mean? At that point, you know what I mean? You're kind of over the barrel because it's allowed and they own the property. You know what I mean? So often it's where in the process, and a lot of that is when you're looking at your code, when you're looking at your municipal laws, you kind of have to, unfortunately, have the foresight of what are the consequences of this change going to be, and how can you use zoning as a tool, not to necessarily try to stop everything, because it's really hard to totally stop development, but how do you decide where things go so it makes sense?
So they're allowed to do it because of the zoning there
Yeah,
in Genesee County.
right. Yeah.
Just a comment first, as I listen to this conversation, something I've understood for a long time is basically, as far as business is concerned, we basically still live in a laissez-faire environment. That business tends to get what they want, do what they want, when they want, and where they want. And we haven't ever had the ability to turn that around. We're a capitalist society, and all of us accept that and embrace that. But we are still controlled by people who are doing things who actually made the laws originally. So that's a different thing. So anyhow,
Yeah.
that's just a comment. Just a quick question.
Sure.
I wonder, Ed mentioned the Kodak parking lots, acres and acres of them. On Lake Avenue, for example, across from Kodak Park, there's grass growing through the asphalt. Do you have any idea at this point who owns those lots? I don't.
I'm not
Wondered.
sure off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of it is still owned by Kodak. Some of it's owned by the county's IDA, their industrial development agency. So I guess it would kind of depend what parcel it is. I'm not particularly sure, but obviously there is and there are efforts to redevelop areas like that, which are, either former industrial uses or, actual brownfield sites.
Yeah.
But they are trickier to redevelop. You know what I mean? There is remediation. There are barriers to, putting something else there, especially when it's a site that's been left for a long time. And then there has to be state money, and then there's a waiting process for that, and you have to get a state award, and you know what I mean? It's one of those things where often the prerequisite hoops to jump through slow it down, which is why there's actually the Citizen Climate Lobby is actually pushing for some deregulation when it comes to development, because we're hitting a point where it's more restrictions are being put on redevelopment than are beneficial.
Yeah.
Obviously there's hope to protect the environment, there's hope to do those sort of things, but if you're not reusing those properties, if you're not taking out that tainted soil, if you're not building renewable energy, you know what I mean, because of all of these, restrictions on the state and local level, you're hurting yourself more than if you
You're benefiting.
you slackened your grip a little bit.
It's a conundrum. I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another quick question too. I'm sorry. I'll go quickly. I grew up in a Rochester that was dense. Rochester had 335,000 people in it.
Yeah.
Now we're down to around 210 or 250, and I don't know the
right now.
actual number. So it's basically a good 33% less. And neighborhoods were dense. I figured, I much later contemplated the little square block I lived in Rochester, in the old Fifth Ward, where the Genesee or the Coca-Cola bottling plant is, had 1,500 people in it. And also, if you went down Clinton, Joseph, Hudson, and so forth, they were all stores side by side with an alley behind it for access, and people lived upstairs. Thousands and thousands of people lived upstairs. Is there any effort to renew that, or go in that direction, or suggestions to go back in that direction again. Like you build a building, there's no reason you couldn't put residential units on top of it with different entrances and different access and so forth, but it's never done.
Yeah, I mean, well, just down the street, over here, there's a very large scale residential development that's going in, that's going to have ground floor commercial. So, what is old is new again, in a lot of ways. And mixed use residential is becoming a popular, development model in a lot of ways because, developers are trying to figure out a way that they can make money on doing this. And there's incentives to build downtown in a lot of cases. There's incentives to have commercial development again in cities. So there is a move towards that, but I mean, it's in fits and spurts. You know what I mean? This isn't, there isn't like a concentrated effort. It's more, if you zone and you permit those type of uses, then you're going to have developers that come to the table. But I mean, that's, again, you have to create, a lot of what happens with zoning now is you're creating conditions to encourage development. You're not directing development, you know what I mean? So, because again, we live in a capitalist society. So you're trying to, do what you can with zoning. Again, like Fairport's downtown district has mixed use, ground floor commercial, upstairs residential for that reason. Because it's like, people like to have more shops, they like to have opportunities. So that part's the benefit. And then if you can stick some apartments above that, that's good too. And again, from a climate standpoint and everything else, that's great because you're some of the patrons of that business are going to live upstairs. They're not going to be driving. They're not going to be parking. They're not going to be doing all those sort of things. So, broadly, there is a trend towards that, but there's not necessarily like a concentrated state or like national initiative towards that outside of things like the smart growth criteria, which is or isn't, part of the decision-making process.
So I have so many things to say here. I'm from Genesee County. And so the stamp project is something I toured the facility, the field back in 2003 when it was initially, being developed, and have been hearing about this for years, including, knowing people who had to sell their homes. They didn't want to leave there. There's not much in Alabama, not much at all. But from everything I've heard, and I don't know what's right and what's wrong, but heard a presentation by GCEDC maybe a month ago, and everything's going great out there. They have companies already there, ready to go, started. And I know that when they started this project, they did a lot of negotiating with the Seneca Nation. It's a buffer zone that's been established. So, I just don't really know. I'm just hearing things that are different than what I've been hearing about as a county resident for a lot of years. And so, and I'm not saying, that you're wrong. I'm not saying they're wrong, but it's tales of two different sides of the story.
What have you been hearing? Because
Well, yeah, I mean, from what GCEDC is saying, things are going really well. I also wanted to, so Genesee County is, a different world than Fairport and Rochester.
Sure.
I live in the small town of Byron.
Yeah.
And, lots and lots and lots of farms surrounded by farmland, which is now we have 3,000 acres that have been leased for solar panel use. And it looks like a construction zone everywhere I go. We are fortunate that we've got a field behind us and next to us. There are no solar panels there. But down the street from us, we've got neighbors who have solar panels behind them, across the street and on the side. It's just, really changed the nature. I'm just bringing that up as an issue. And I think about the wildlife. They can't land in the fields and they can't run through the fields and just what that's done to the nature of this small town.
Well, and I think that kind of shows the tricky balance, right, of where do you develop? How do you balance private property rights? You know what I mean? It's not like they're forcing these solar farms upon the landowners. You know what I mean? Like they're coming, so there's an incentive to the property owner to lease that land. You know what I mean? And that's why it's being built there. So, and, as has tried to be done in a lot of places, you don't control the view, living out, my friend who lived in Colorado lived in Boulder for quite a while. And, that was a big debate there about development and building heights because they didn't want to block anyone's view of the mountains because of the implications of property value and quality of life and everything else. But, where do your property rights, extend? Where do they overlap with other people's is always, part of the discussion. And depending on how strong an area's zoning is, in some cases you can do that. Boulder has a very restrictive code, when it comes to that, which is part of the reason it's so incredibly expensive to live there because it's difficult to develop there. Where places like rural Genesee County is going to have slacker, zoning and planning restrictions. And there's going to be, farmers and landowners that go, hey, maybe I don't want to farm that section of field anymore. I can lease this to a solar company. They'll put up all these panels, you know what I mean? And so that's, part of it as well is, Yeah. No, yeah.
I want to piggyback on what Bob was saying. I'm really mostly concerned about around our neighborhood right here in this part of Rochester.
Mhm.
And several months back, I cut the article out of the newspaper. It was a special project from Broad Street to Genesee Street.
Mhm.
And in September, they were the people who were interested in getting this part of this $10 million grant
Mhm.
from the city would have to put in their plans.
Mhm.
And then in the middle of October, they were to decide who would get these grants.
Mhm.
And then in November, construction would start. And priority was given to stores or buildings along that section of Main Street
Mhm.
that had possibility of residences above. And so they would get, these groups or these people who applied would get 90%. They'd have to put 10% of their own money in for their plan and they'd get 90%. But priority was given for that very reason because housing is at a premium.
Mhm.
And I just want to know the parking lot thing, maybe I'm naive, but why can't they just take the asphalt out and make them green spaces right now? And if there's stuff underneath there that needs to be, mitigated or whatever, they did it in Greece at some plant that was out there. And for years, it was all green and they had these tubes going down into the ground and
Mhm.
now it's usable.
Yeah.
So
It depends sometimes, to talk about that, because sometimes leaving the asphalt sort of works as a cap, because a lot of the time on these brownfield redevelopments, they'll excavate as much soil as they can, and then they'll put like a clay cap or something like that over it to try to prevent stormwater permeating into it. So in some cases, having that impermeable asphalt surface sort of works as that until they can get to the remediation phase of coming in and removing it. It's an imperfect way. It's a good way to not have to do anything. But that's sort of the rationale behind it is, we don't want the stormwater coming in to those contaminated areas and leaching that out into the groundwater and elsewhere. That's not always the case, but that's sometimes, and I can't specifically speak to those parking lots, but I have seen that as the rationale before.
But that brings up a question that I hadn't planned to ask, but
Hmm?
will quickly.
Yeah.
How about having no driving in the city and having places to park outside so people could not contaminate the city? And the other one is about this stamp project. I've been getting requests from some organization that I thought it was called Stamp, asking us to please do something to prevent this from happening. It's from the Seneca people.
Hmm.
And I just wonder how many of the Seneca people are promoting this. And I'm thinking that we often give a land acknowledgement
Mhm.
before we start. And I'm thinking that that's good, but if we could do something to help this, if this really is, and it sounds as if it's contaminating the little bit of land the Seneca Nation has left.
Yeah, there's some groups out there. There's allies of the Tonawanda Seneca Nation that's doing some activism to oppose stamp. If you are out there and driving around, you'll see a lot of the no stamp signs. And obviously the nation itself is like very involved financially and legally in combating it. And I've been able to speak with them about it, and I'm sure that anyone that's looking to do that. But again, allies of the Tonawanda Seneca Nation sort of has been my touchstone to some of the opposition out there to get their thoughts on why they're opposing the group out there. So that might be a good place to go to be involved if you'd like.
I was going to add that Sierra Club is
Hmm.
also involved and participated in that suit.
That's correct. Yep.
So
Yep,
if
that's
you-
true.
All you have to do is Google the stamp project opposition and you will find a way to speak up against this.
Yeah, it's well organized, and thank you. Yeah, that's true. The Sierra Club was very involved.
I don't know if you finished your presentation or,
Yes, yeah, I think we're off to.
okay. That's good timing. Elaine, you had?
You piqued my interest when you said that hydroelectric was going to be used in that process.
Mhm.
I didn't know there was hydroelectric to be used because there's so many users of it already
Mhm.
across the state.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time, it's, essentially, shares or, usage of that source of electricity are used or acquired by the developer or not the developing corporation in that sense, so that they can say, hey, this is using green energy or this is using hydropower. But obviously, it's a major use out in Buffalo, out in that region out there as well. I don't off the top of my head remember exactly how many megawatts of power they were promising were going to come from hydropower, but obviously when you're talking about a data center and the amount of energy that would use, even considering some of those other light industrial uses they were looking at, there's a possibility of on-site generation. I know that all the project plans included propane generator schematics for huge propane generators, if there was a power outage or something like that. And then they had to have on-site storage for the propane as well. And I mean, this was all talked about, during the planning process with GCEDC. So yeah, there's definitely some thoughts and some concerns about how it's going to work. I mean, I've been hearing people talk about, is there an opportunity for modular nuclear, not for that site, but for data centers in general, because of the sheer volume of energy that they take. I mean, obviously, out near Seneca Lake, there's a former peaker power plant that's being used for a crypto mining facility out there, where they had a plant that had been put down to only be used, at peak need, and now is running, pretty much around the clock to power the crypto mining facility there, which, again, if you're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions and climate and everything else, that's something that had been wound down by the state intentionally, to have that natural gas be replaced by, renewable energy that is now back online and operating. Because we're seeing for the first time in quite a number of years, energy demand growing in the US, and a lot of that is connected to data centers and crypto mining and uses like that, because they're very energy intensive.
Yeah. I think we have just time for one last question, Pat.
Yeah, the state and federal levels have been very much about a CHIP Act and bringing manufacturing back to the United States.
Mhm.
So how much of an impact does that, I mean, don't the developers feel like empowered by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, the example I talked about in Utica, it taps into some of that CHIPS Act funding, and Chuck Schumer was there for the ribbon cutting and that sort of thing, because there's a lot of federal money into that. And when it comes to semiconductors, they're in everything now. There's thousands of them in newer cars. They're in your fridge. They're in obviously your smartphone, your computer, everything. And there's part of the reason that they're looking to onshore some of that manufacturing is Taiwan produces an overwhelming majority of that now. And there's national security concerns about if all of our production comes from Taiwan, if there was conflict or something like that, there was a disruption, what would happen? And yeah, that's part of the reason that, these greenfield sites are now competing over it. That's why Micron's being built near Syracuse, in a lot of ways too, is to leverage that CHIPS money. And so obviously, you know, there's, as with everything else we've talked about today, there's layers to this, you know what I mean? And, you know, that are all sort of competing somewhat either against themselves or certainly against those more, you know, environmental and climate related concerns.
Steve, we want to thank you very much. You have no need to hide behind a computer. You've been a great speaker, and with a talk on zoning, we're aware that there's lots of difficult choices that you have to pick and choose from, and I don't know, there are no easy answers. And
Yeah, the more you learn about things, the more questions and more conflicts come out, I think. The curse of knowledge.
Yeah. The curse of knowledge, yes. Well, we'll contribute to the curse of knowledge next week at Sunday Forum when we have Katie Stoss from RIT talking about plastics in our water and microplastics. And please come and feel more cursed. Well, it keeps us humble to realize that there are difficult choices. Thank you all for coming, and thanks very much, Steve.
Very well.
Well done.
Yes. Yeah.
Got a son in San Diego, which
Oh.
is very expensive now.
Mhm.
Great demand for property.
Yeah.
His college professor income. He was lucky enough to get a very modest condo several years ago.
Yeah.
Two-story neighborhood.
Well,
Now his view is blocked by a six-story.
monolith in the way. Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's all too common a story. You know what I mean? And I think, you know, there's nothing, for better or worse, there's nothing unique about